Hi, today we're talking about what happens in the first stage of divorce regarding the breakdown of your marriage. We've talked about how there are two key phases in divorce proceedings for a civil marriage in our earlier videos. Phase 1 involves the dissolution and termination of the civil marriage, and Phase 2 involves setting out how the persons will deal with all other ancillary matters, meaning additional and supplementary matters regarding things such as custody, care and control of the children, dividing matrimonial assets and properties, and maintenance payments for the wife and children. In Phase 1, the person applying for the divorce must prove to the court that there's a basis to allow a divorce. According to Singapore divorce law, a divorce can only be allowed by the court when there's proof of something called the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. You can prove the irretrievable breakdown in the marriage by showing that any one of these following events have taken place. Number 1, adultery. This means that your spouse has committed adultery, meaning voluntary sexual intercourse and relations between a married person and a person who is not their spouse, and you now feel that it is intolerable to live with your spouse. Adequate and enough evidence is required to prove that the defendant's, your spouse's act of adultery. You may want to engage a private investigator to obtain evidence showing your spouse's adultery, and this is done in most cases. Unreasonable behavior is the second. This means that your spouse has behaved in an unreasonable manner that you feel that it is now impossible to continue living with your spouse. Some examples of unreasonable behavior include the following: domestic violence and physical abuse, verbal, emotional and psychological abuse, compulsive gambling, alcoholism and other addictive or obsessive behavior with an unhealthy, negative or destructive impact on the well-being of the family unit. There could also be the improper association of your spouse with another person, such as having a girlfriend or boyfriend outside of the marriage. The third grounds is desertion. This means that your spouse has deserted and abandoned you for at least 2 years and shows no intention or indication of returning. There's also separation, and this means that you and your spouse have lived apart and maintained separate households in practice and in fact, and you need to be separated for at least 3 years if both you and your spouse agree to using separation as the basis for divorce, and this is known as separation with consent. If, however, your spouse doesn't agree to using separation as the basis for divorce, then you'll need to be separated for at least 4 years, and this is known as separation without consent. Proving the events relating to the irretrievable breakdown of your marriage will be a question of fact that the court will consider in court. This means that you will need to prove your version of events based on evidence if your spouse challenges, disagrees, or contests your claims. A contested divorce and trial can be long drawn out and require you and your witnesses to give evidence during court sessions and hearings, after which the court will make a final decision and deliver its judgment. If you and your spouse agree and do not contest that the irretrievable breakdown of your marriage has occurred, then this phase of the divorce process doesn't need to involve a trial. So will you get a better or more favorable outcome if your spouse caused or was responsible for the breakdown of the marriage and can be said to be the person at fault for causing the divorce? This is a very common question asked by people thinking about getting a divorce. And it's important to know that according to Singapore divorce and family law, the court generally does not consider the reasons for the divorce and the breakdown of the marriage when it decides later on how to handle the ancillary matters. That's why, in reality, there may not be much or any advantage if you can gain by proving that your spouse was at fault or responsible for causing the divorce. If you are represented by a divorce lawyer, he or she would be able to tell you more about whether the breakdown of the marriage will affect the court's handling of your ancillary matters in your divorce. After the court is convinced that your marriage has irretrievably broken down, for example, if this was agreed or consented to by you and your spouse, or if you've managed to successfully prove this at a trial, the court will then issue what is called an interim judgment, which is an order of court to dissolve and terminate the marriage, after which the divorce will then move into the second phase, phase 2, and involving the ancillary matters. So there you have it, some very basic information about what happens in the first stage of the divorce regarding the breakdown of the marriage. Thanks for watching.